Stephen D. Richards, known by the nicknames the Nebraska Fiend and the Ohio Monster, was an American serial killer who confessed to committing 9 to 11 murders in Nebraska and Iowa between 1876 and 1878. When he later confessed to his crimes, he claimed to have committed the first murder sometime in late 1876, 2 weeks after arriving in Kearney, Nebraska. He went on to commit several other murders, which he later claimed were done in self-defense. He was regarded as handsome and charismatic by some contemporary chroniclers, who described his appearance and behavior as completely obscuring his nature as a cold-blooded killer. In modern times, he is known as Nebraska's first documented serial killer in Nebraska, and the first person to be executed by the state. In the mid-19th century, Nebraska experienced a period of territorial expansion in the wake of the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which saw the creation of Nebraska and Kansas territories to facilitate the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. In 1867, Nebraska was admitted into the Union as the 37th state, 2 years after the conclusion of the American Civil War. Nebraska's newfound statehood led to an influx of settlers among the growing population and political controversies incited by the state's first governor, David Butler. Renewed calls for a state constitution were made in 1871. During Richard's crime spree and trial, Nebraska's law and justice system had only recently been developed, with the state's criminal code written into the state law by 1871. Before his execution, the state had only one recorded execution, in 1863, 4 years before its inclusion into the US. Stephen Decatur Richards was born in Wheeling, Virginia on the 18th of March, 1856. He was said to have 5 sisters and 1 brother. When he was 6, his family relocated to Ohio, first to Monroe County and then to Noble County. The family then later settled in the Quaker village of Mount Pleasant in Ohio when he was 11. He described his mother as a devout Methodist and his father, a farmer, as having made no profession of religion. Richard attended a school in Mount Pleasant. He claimed that the teachers considered him well behaved. At his mother's insistence, he also attended Sunday school and church regularly. Up until the age of 20, he lived with his parents, working farmers and other locals in the area. On the 16th of September 1871, his mother died of an unknown cause. At the age of 20, he met and became engaged to a young woman named Anna Milhorn, with whom he corresponded during his later travels. He also met men whom he described as being of questionable occupation. He began passing counterfeit bills he obtained from a man in New York City. In February 1876, he left Mount Pleasant, heading west for better career opportunities. For a short time, he lived in Iowa and worked as a farmhand in Burlington and Morning Sun. He was later hired as an attendant at the Iowa Lunatic Asylum, now the Mount Pleasant Mental Health Institute in Mount Pleasant, Iowa, tasked with burying deceased patients. The New York Times wrote Richard's time working at the asylum was a significant event in his life that shaped his own humanity and his view of the human race. While he denied witnessing any abuse of the asylum's patients, he later reflected that during his tenure of handling and disposing of deceased patients, he became accustomed to viewing people as nothing more than meat. He left the asylum in October 1876 and began drifting around the Midwestern US, finding intermittent work and occasionally consorting with train robbers. He stayed in Kansas City briefly before moving to Nebraska, where he passed through Hastings before arriving in Kearney, residing there for 2 to 3 weeks before leaving for Cheyenne County. According to Richards, he became involved in several gunfights during his stay. That resulted in him shooting each individual, although he stated that he was unaware of their condition after each confrontation. During this period, Richards went under the name of William Hudson and later discarded this once he reached Kansas City. In a confession written after his final arrest, he admitted to having killed 4 men during his travels around Nebraska and Iowa between 1876 and 1877. He described committing his first murder sometime in late 1876, 2 weeks after arriving in Kearney. Contemporary newspaper reports of the site of Richard's first murder varied, some saying it was near Dobbytown and others giving it as near Sand Hills. According to Richards, he met a man while travelling on horseback through the Nebraska countryside, and the pair decided to camp for the night near Dobbytown. Several newspapers reported that the 2 men's campsite were instead near Sand Hills. Settling down for the night, the 2 began gambling in a game of cards, with Richard winning most of the stranger's money. As the 2 set off for Kearney the following morning, the other man turned on Richard and demanded his money back. Richard refused, whereupon he claimed the other man became belligerent. Richard then shot him above the left eye, killing him instantly. After confirming the man was dead, he disposed of the body in the Platte River. Several days later, he continued his trek to Kearney. Richard encountered another man 50 miles from the area called Walker's Ranch. The man had seen Richard with the previous traveller together, and the stranger asked what had become of the man. While talking to him, Richard realised that this man and the deceased were friends and business partners. Richard denied any knowledge of the dead man, but the friend continued to hound Richard with questions, which caused Richard to become increasingly anxious. Believing the man knew too much, Richard decided to kill the stranger to prevent any discovery of the murder. When the stranger turned his back to Richards, he shot him in the back of the head. He disposed of the corpse and then sold the man's horse in a nearby town. Before reaching Kearney, he then stopped at the home of Jasper Halston, who, according to Richards, was a train robber. Mary, Jasper's wife, noticed upon his arrival that Richard's shirt was stained with blood and commented on it. Richards had not noticed the blood on his clothes and claimed to have replied, as if in jest, that it must have come from the men he had murdered. That ended the conversation. After a stay, Richard travelled to Cedar Rapids, Iowa, where he used counterfeit money to purchase a horse and a buggy from an unidentified man. After he left, the seller discovered the bills were not genuine. Tracking Richards down, the seller demanded that Richards give him real money or return the horse and buggy. With Richard refusing both demands, the man threatened to have him arrested, and Richard responded by shooting him. He then buried the body and left the area. In March 1877, Richards and a young man with the surname Gemge left Grand Island, Nebraska on horseback and headed towards Kearney. As they neared their destination, they stopped and camped for the night between Lowell and Kearney along the Platte River. Richards woke up at about 3 a.m. and rused his partner, telling him that it was nearly morning and that they should get back to work. Gemge, infuriated at being awakened so early, began arguing with Richards. The argument continued. Richard later recounted. After leaving the area, Richard arrived at Kearney, registering under the name F.A. Hodge at a local hotel. During his stay, Richards reunited with several old acquaintances, George Dutch Henry Johnson and his companion Hurst, as well as a man who went by the name Mr. Burns. On the 21st of March, Richards was arrested along with Burns, whom he had been spending most of his time with. At the time, both men were not told as to the reason of their arrest, although Richards came to suspect that it was for the murder of Gemge. It was only later that they were notified by the authorities that they were under suspicion of the murder of a man named Peter Geetway, whom Richard claimed his innocence over. Although Richard was soon acquitted, Burns was held in custody because of a testimony of a sporting lady whom he had previously been acquainted with. Burns would also be acquitted sometime later after no evidence was found linking him to the crime. Newspaper coverage of the Halson family, spelled as Harrelson in this account, and Anderson murders. In June 1878, while in Kearney, he was arrested and jailed for larceny. He later claimed that his charge was unfounded. During his time in jail, he reunited with Mary L. Halson. Shortly before Richard's arrival, she had been arrested under suspicion of having aided the escape of her husband and another prisoner named Underwood or Nixon from the Kearney jail. Richards and Mary Halson agreed that she would sell him the deed to her property 6 months later for $600, $17,000 in 2023. After Richards was released from jail, he travelled around Nebraska for several months. He did business in Hastings, Bloomington, and Grand Island before arriving at the Halsons' Kearney County homestead on the 18th of October, 1878. Mary Halson transferred the property to Richards upon his arrival. The New York Daily Herald later reported that Richards had married Halson on the 2nd of November in what the newspaper alleged was a scam to acquire ownership of Halson's land. A month later, Richard decided to kill Halson and her 3 children, 10-year-old Daisy, 4-year-old Mabel, and 2-year-old Jasper, nicknamed Jesse. In his confession, Richard claimed that Halson had discovered that he was guilty of murder, and he feared that she might betray his presence to the authorities. To silence Halson and ensure that his previous crimes remained hidden, Richard resolved to murder the entire family. On the 3rd of November 1878, Richards got up early in the morning along with another man named Brown, who had been staying at the house. Brown left to feed the horses and complete other chores around the farm. Richards found a spade and dug a hole, then sneaked back into the house and murdered Mary, Daisy, Mabel, and Jessie with an axe. According to one report, Mary and one of the children were murdered with a soothing iron, while the other 2 were physically assaulted. This claim was also reported by some modern-day sources who graphically described Richards killing Jasper by bashing his head against the wall. However, these alternate details of the murder were refuted by Richards himself, saying that he'd killed the family while they were asleep. He said that most of them had died after the several blows, with the exception of Daisy, who had writhed in pain for some time by Richards' own account. He was said to have scrubbed the blood off the floor and himself after the murders before calmly sitting down for breakfast. After he had eaten, he carried the bodies out of the house and buried them in the hole he had dug nearby. When he was later questioned about the Halsons' disappearance, he told several people that the family had left with Brown and that he didn't know when they would return. A 21st century account stated Richards had made claims of Halson transferring the deeds of the farm to him and subsequently left with her children to reunite with her husband. The bodies of Halson and her children were discovered on the 11th of December. Some reports said that they had been concealed underneath a haystack rather than buried, as Richards had later claimed. On the 9th of December 1878, Richards agreed to help his neighbour, a 26-year-old immigrant from Sweden named Peter Anderson, with some work on Anderson's property. The Columbus Journal reported that Richard had used the alias Dick Richardson when working for Anderson. On the 9th of December, Anderson became ill after eating a meal Richards had prepared, causing him to suspect that Richards had poisoned him. Anderson informed a neighbour of his suspicions. The next day, he confronted Richards. The two fought, and Richards either beat Anderson to death with a hammer or hatchet, or shot him. Contemporary newspaper accounts vary. Anderson's body was later discovered in the cellar of his house, buried underneath a pile of coal. Richards strongly denied poisoning Anderson, saying that it was not his style. He claimed Anderson had attacked him with a knife and that he'd killed Anderson in self-defense. Anderson was later buried at the Bethany Cemetery in Axel, Nebraska. Richards fled Kearney shortly after Anderson's murder, expecting the bodies would soon be discovered. In the evening, he was hitching up Anderson's horses and preparing to leave. Some of Anderson's neighbours arrived. They had noticed Anderson's absence and questioned him about it. He reportedly told them that Anderson was inside the house. As Anderson's neighbours entered the dwelling, Richards fled on horseback, riding to Bloomington. He travelled east by horse and train and on foot, passing through Omaha and Chicago. While on the run, he met up with Jasper Halson and Halson's fellow escaped prisoner. The three travelled through Wheeling, West Virginia, and into Ohio, passing through Bridgeport, before arriving in Richards' hometown of Mount Pleasant. Nebraska Governor Silas Garber issued an arrest warrant for Richards on the 16th of December 1876 and promised a reward of $200, $6,000 in 2023, for his arrest and conviction. Most accounts state that on the 20th of December, after Richards arrived in Mount Pleasant, he attended a ballroom dance accompanied by two unidentified women. Copies of a wanted poster featuring Richards had been circulated throughout the town recently, and a constable named McGrew recognised him from the poster. He enlisted the help of a penitentiary guard named Folg, and the two men armed themselves with shotguns and set off after Richards. They found him walking through a field just outside the town with two women. He was unarmed and quickly surrendered. Richard claimed that he'd spotted the two officers approaching him, intending to fight his way out of the situation. He told the women to head back to town. They refused, however, so Richard chose to surrender. He said that if the woman had left, he would have avoided arrest. Richard said that if he had escaped, he would have gone to Nebraska, as he reasoned that it was the last place anyone would look for him. Some accounts differed about the date and place of Richard's arrest. The Wheeling Daily Intelliger said that upon arriving in a town near Mount Pleasant, he was identified by a former acquaintance who detained him with the help of another person. One source claims that Richard was arrested in early 1879 in Austin, Texas. One modern-day account reported that Richards, whom they listed under the name Samuel Richards, had been identified and captured by Pinkerton agents. There were even conflicting descriptions of Richards' appearance. Newspapers described him as being approximately 6'2" and heavy built with dark hair and blue eyes. However, the account of Dr. Morland, who performed a phrenological examination of Richards before his execution, conflicted with these descriptions of him. In his examination report, Morland said Richards had light brown hair and dark grey eyes. At his execution, one spectator later described Richards as having steel grey eyes that were almost bluish in colour with dark brown hair. The Working Man's Friend, Leavenworth, Kansas newspaper reported that Chicago authorities received part of the reward. After his arrest, Richards was jailed in Steubenville, Ohio. While he was there, he wrote 2 articles for the local newspaper confessing to 9 murders in 3 years. Sheriff David Anderson of Buffalo County, Nebraska, and Sheriff Marin of Kearney County, both of whom had pursued Richards to Ohio, returned into Nebraska. Due to local public outrage, Anderson and Martin feared that Richards would be lynched if he were returned to any of the localities where he'd committed his crimes, so it was decided to avoid taking him to these places initially. At the time of Richards' arrest, the authorities suspected he was a member of a gang of outlaws who had plagued the state, or was even the group's leader. Law enforcement was able to definitively link Richards to 9 murders, to which he had confessed, and suggested that he might have killed even more, something the Nebraska State Journal expressed doubt on. Shortly before his trial, Richards predicted that he would be convicted and hanged for his crimes. He was moved to jail in Omaha on the 28th of December, then transferred to Kearney by train. On the 30th of December, a large crowd enraged townsfolk gathered outside the jail in Kearney where Richards was being kept. Fearing a lynching, authorities took extra precautions to ensure Richards' safety as well as their own. Whilst being moved to the depot, Richards was said to have been impressed by the large crowd, asking whether the whole town was here to see him. Eventually, the crowd dispersed, and there was no further incidents during the rest of his stay in Kearney. Richards' trial began on the 16th of January 1879 in Minden, Nebraska, with Judge William Gaslin presiding. The prosecution was led by a district attorney named Schofield, and Richards' defense was led by a lawyer named Savage. Schofield laid out the two indictments for murder in the first degree for the killings of the Halson family and not Anderson. Richards pleaded not guilty, arguing that Anderson's killing was in self-defense and therefore justifiable. The prosecution called 7 witnesses to the stand. They all testified to the state in which Anderson was found. Richards then was called to testify. When questioned by Schofield, he admitted to killing Anderson with a hammer after a heated argument, but reiterated that he had done so in self-defense. Richards said, although repeatedly warned not to do so, Anderson had reached for a nearby hatchet. The prosecution then entered into evidence the hammer that had been used to kill Anderson. Richards identified it as the murder weapon. After 2 hours of deliberation, the jury found Richards guilty for the murder of the Halsons and Anderson. He was sentenced to death by hanging, and his execution date was set for the 26th of April, 1879. Richards was described as being cheerful and indifferent to both the proceedings and his conviction. The Sedalia Weekly Bazoo reported that, shortly after his conviction, Richards managed to smuggle a knife into his cell to use it for killing himself, but the weapon was discovered by authorities and confiscated before he could use it. However, no other newspaper records corroborate this story. When Richards was returned to Nebraska, the Omaha Herald wrote that he after his conviction, Sheriff Marin announced that his execution in Minden would be open to the public, even though Marin feared the attendance of a large number of spectators could become violent. To prevent a riot, an enclosure was constructed around the gallows to separate the expected crowd from Richards. However, tickets that allowed admittance into the restricted area were sold. Richards was allowed to invite people he chose, members of the press, whom he had befriended while in prison. One such ticket of attendance was recently discovered and is now in the collection of the Nebraska Historical Society. Spectators at the execution were said to have been numbered between 2,000 and 25,000. As the crowd became increasingly agitated, the authorities pleaded with them to stay outside the enclosure, but guards were unable to prevent the spectators from destroying the barrier. One witness in the incident, a man named Rolf Johnson, later wrote that 20 to 30 people in the crowd cut the rope as authorities tried to stop the crowd. The mob proceeded to pull the post out of the ground, attempting to drag the makeshift barrier away whilst the guards were pulling the rope at the other end in what Johnson described as a tug-of-war. The mob succeeded in pulling the rope away from the guards and then proceeded to destroy the barrier completely. At 1 p.m, Richards was led to the gallows by Marin and his deputy. This pacified the crowd. Upon descending the gallows, Richards launched into an impassionate defence of his actions. He claimed that the killing of Anderson was in self-defence and disavowed any involvement in the murders of the Halson family. He claimed that he was a victim of wrongful conviction. He then said that he had found the Lord, made his peace with God, and had faith in Christ, and asked the crowd to join in singing the hymn, "Come thou font of every blessing." Every such spectator documenting the events of the execution in his journal observed that Richards appeared calm and collected during the entire ordeal. Richards' final words were said to have been, "Jesus be with me now." Reverend W. Sanford G., who presided over the execution, later told reporters that he hoped Richards' professions of religious salvation were genuine, but allowed that they might not have been. At 1:17 p.m. on the 26th of April, 1879, Richards was hanged. The St. Louis Globe-Democrat said that it took 15 minutes for him to die. Richards was the first person in Nebraska's history to be executed since its incorporation into the US in 1867. Shortly after his execution, a photographer was able to capture a photograph of Richards' corpse propped inside a coffin. This image is available to view on Google. Local doctors hounded Richards before his execution, requesting him to donate his body for medical purposes. He refused and was buried in Minden. Despite his gravesite being guarded, his corpse was stolen the night after his execution. The Sedalia Weekly Bazoo suspected that the doctors who had wanted to examine him, but he was returned to his resting place shortly thereafter. Sometime later, his body was dug up once again. This time, Richards's bones were scattered on the streets of Kearney. On the 1st of November 1882, it was reported that the Kearney County Gazette had obtained Richards's skull and placed it on display in the newspaper's office window. This was the last reported mention of Richards's skull. Its present location and status is unknown. After his arrest, many people described him as charismatic, commenting that he successfully concealed his dark nature under a polite, articulate, and handsome exterior. A friend who accompanied his autobiographer to his interview said during one visit, he didn't have the look of a murderer. Contemporary observers remarked that he seemed to feel no guilt whatsoever about his crimes. Numerous times between his arrest and execution, he was asked why he had no empathy towards his victims or remorse for his crimes. Sometimes he simply refused to answer. When he did choose to reply to this question, he gave conflicting responses. He usually cited his associations with the people of questionable morals at his time working at the Mount Pleasant Asylum as deleterious influences. When the Nebraska State Journal questioned him about his lack of remorse for the heinous murders he had committed, particularly those of the Harrison family, he recounted an event from his childhood. He had been tasked to kill a little litter of kittens and did so by bashing their heads against a tree. After he had killed all the kittens, he found that he had no guilt about it and found the killing fun. Although some outlets, including the modern-day author Michael Newton, classified Richards as a thrill killer, in interviews with the press, Richards adamantly denied that he enjoyed inflicting pain upon others, claiming that in his younger years, other people had considered him to be kind. Reporters who interviewed him after his arrest were often struck by his calm and collected behaviour. An article in the New York Daily Herald described him as being carefree and cheerful. In an interview with the Wheeling Daily Intelligencer, Richards said that he knew he would be executed for his crimes, but that he was unafraid of death and was ready to meet it. When the jury sentenced him to death, he was said to have been unconcerned and in good spirits. The St. Louis Globe-Democrat, which doubted that he had committed the 9 murders, reported that Richards broke down during his final moments, but this was contradicted by other newspapers' accounts of his execution. Criminal psychology and profiling was not used as an investigative technique until the Jack the Ripper murders in 1888, 9 years after Richards' execution. In 2018, forensic psychologist Catherine Ramsland referred to Richards as the Old West's Ted Bundy. Both Richards and Bundy used their charisma to manipulate others, and both displayed a complete lack of remorse for their crimes. Ramsland also wrote that the differences between the two men, noting that Bundy murdered for sexual gratification, whereas Richards had no preferred method of killing or type of victim. Furthermore, Bundy fought his execution while Richard was indifferent to his death sentence. She further described a possible reason for his violent behaviour, citing a severe head injury that he received shortly before the killing started. Richards himself briefly mentioned this injury to the Sedalia Weekly Bazoo, claiming that he received the injury whilst travelling with several companions in the spring of 1877. When pressed about the circumstances that led to the injury, Richards refused to elaborate on the incident. Richards used various aliases during his travels. In one account of his life published in the Sedalia Weekly Bazoo, he admitted to having used the false names George Gallagher, F.A. Hodge, and William Hudson. He also admitted to corresponding with various acquaintances under the names D.J. Roberts, J. Littleton, and W.A. Littleton. At the time of his arrest and execution, it was a popular belief that all criminals were of poor quality and limited education. The horrific nature of his crimes gave him some notoriety, which increased after his capture due to in part of his not fitting with the public's preconception of criminals, with reporters and members of the public often struck by his charisma, good looks, his education, and outspokenness. He was featured in a handful of books and periodicals. The first of these was The Philosophy of Insanity, Richard the Nebraska Fiend, by Dr. John Sanderson Christensen, published on the 9th February 1879. A Nebraska State Journal interview with Richards before his execution was published in a trail pamphlet titled Life and Confession of Stephen D. Richards, the murderer of 9 persons executed at Minden, Nebraska, April 26, 1879. The pamphlet, published on the 1st of May 1879, 5 days after his hanging, includes entries about other contemporary criminal cases as well. After his execution, interest in Richards dwindled and he subsequently faded from public memory. In modern times, Richards is now acknowledged as Nebraska's first documented serial killer. NET Nebraska's documentary, Until He Is Dead, A History of Nebraska's Death Penalty, featured Richards as a prime example of the public spectacle of the state's early executions. The documentary mistakenly mentioned him under his Samuel Richards alias. An episode of the Sci-Fi Channel documentary series Paranormal Witness titled The Nebraska Fiend, features a family who's purportedly being tormented by Richard's spirit, with an unnamed actor betraying him. He was featured in the 2021 novel The Scarlet Pen, written by Jennifer Ularic as part of the historical crime series True Colours. The novel is a fictionalised version of Richard's interaction with his fiancée, to whom he regularly sent letters. Gordon Frederick Cummings was a British serial killer known as the Blackout Killer, Blackout Ripper, and the Wartime Ripper, who murdered 4 women and attempted to murder 2 others over a 6-day period in London in February 1942. He's also suspected of committing 2 earlier murders in October 1941. Convicted of the murder of 34-year-old Evelyn Oatley, Cummings was sentenced to death and hanged at HMP Wandsworth on the 25th of June 1942. He became known as the Blackout Killer and the Blackout Ripper because he committed his murders during the imposed wartime blackout and because the extensive mutilations inflicted upon 3 of his victims' bodies. He is also known as the Wartime Ripper as his murders were committed at the height of World War II. The murders committed by him have been described by one detective superintendent within the Metropolitan Police as by far the most vicious he ever investigated during his entire career. Gordon Frederick Cummings was born in New Earswick, North Riding of Yorkshire on the 18th of February 1914, the first of 4 children born to John Cummings and his wife Amelia. John was a civil servant who ran a school for delinquent youths, and Amelia was a housewife. As a child, Cummings received a private education in Llandovery, South Wales, although contemporary reports from his years at the Llandovery County Intermediate Secondary School describe his academic performance as unremarkable, with teachers later recollecting he was much more preoccupied with socialising than his studies. Nonetheless, he did obtain a diploma in chemistry at the age of 16. After completing his schooling in 1930, he attended Northampton College of Technology. He abandoned his studies on the 1st of November 1932. At the age of 18, he moved to Newcastle, where he briefly worked as an industrial chemist. He was dismissed from his job after 5 months. In August 1933, he obtained employment as a tanner in Northampton, but was fired for poor timekeeping after 13 months. Afterwards alternating between part-time work and casual labour. In October 1934, he relocated to London and obtained a job as a leather dresser in a clothing factory, earning £3 a week. He later trained to become a foreman at this firm. While living in London, he developed the desire to live the life of an aristocrat. He frequented hotels and clubs in the West End, falsely claiming to acquaintances to be the illegitimate son of a peer and also claiming to receive an allowance from this fabled individual. To support his contention, he refined his accent to imitate that of someone from Oxford and insisted on being referred to as the Honourable Gordon Cummings. He also frequently engaged in acts of theft or embezzlement to financially maintain this facade and regularly bragged to colleagues of his sexual excursions with local women. To his employers, his extravagant lifestyle impacted his work performance and he was fired from his job on the 8th of February 1935. Shortly thereafter, he moved into his brother's flat in Queen's Mews, Bayswater, as he considered his next career move. By early 1935, he had figured out what his next career move would be. He decided to volunteer to join in the RAF. He enlisted at the Aircrew Reception Centre in Regent's Park, London, where both 7 members of the RAF and new recruits were assessed for training. He was regarded by superiors as an ambitious individual, although his boastful attitude and false claims of nobility made him unpopular with his fellow servicemen, who ended up giving him the nickname of the Duke. In May 1936, he met Marjorie Stevens, the secretary of a West End theatre producer, at an Empire Air Day show in the village of Henlow. After 7 months, the couple married at the Paddington Registry Office on the 28th of December that year. They had no children. Initially, he was stationed with the Marine and Armament Experimental Establishment at Felixstowe, Suffolk. Between 1936 and 1939, he relocated with this military research to test organisation to Scotland. On the 25th of October 1939, shortly after the outbreak of World War II, he was transferred to Helensburgh, Dunbartonshire. While he remained stationed in Dunbartonshire until April 1941, he was posted to Cologne, Wiltshire. At this posting, he reached the junior rank of leading aircraft man, although he held aspirations to become a Spitfire pilot. On the 10th of November 1941, he was posted to Cornwall. At his new posting, his boastful and arrogant behaviour among his fellow airmen earned him the nickname The Count. While stationed in Cornwall, he joined a Falmouth social club named the Blue Peter Club and occasionally assisted in the proprietaries by tending the bar. However, he was relieved of his bartending duties within weeks when found to be serving free drinks to RAF personnel. Then the proprietress discovered that approximately £35 worth of jewellery had been stolen from her apartment. Although both the proprietress and the local police suspected him of committing this theft, no evidence was found to prove his guilt. In the following January, having accrued over 1,000 hours of flight experience, he appeared before the RAF selection board to take an aviation exam. His exemplary performance earned him a transfer to the Air Crew Receiving Centre in Regent's Park, where he was stationed with 300 other men. He was ordered to report for duty at 10 a.m. on the 2nd of February 1942. Cummings is known to have murdered at least 4 women and to have attempted to murder 2 others over a period of 6 days in February 1942. He is also suspected of previously murdering 2 other women in October 1941. The majority of his known victims were women whom he encountered in or near to West End pubs and clubs who engaged in prostitution, typically with servicemen. All of his known murders and attempted murders were committed in London during wartime blackout conditions imposed in September 1939. By the time of his 1942 arrest, he had neither a previous criminal record or a known history of violence. He is suspected of committing his first 2 murders in October 1941. His first suspected victim was a 19-year-old clerk named Mabel Churchyard, who was murdered on the 13th of October. She is known to have frequently engaged in casual sexual relations with servicemen. Her nude body was found by workmen in a bombed house in Hampstead Road the day after her murder. She had been strangled to death by an individual described by a pathologist who examined her body as being a left-handed individual, after the bruising around her neck indicated that the murderer had more strength in his left hand than his right. In addition, her handbag had been emptied with several contents missing. She hadn't been essayed. Her death is believed to have occurred at approximately 9:15 p.m. 4 days later, on the 17th of October, a 48-year-old widow named Edith Eleanora Humphreys was found laying on a bed at a Regent's Park home. She had been extensively bludgeoned around the face and head before her assailant had attempted to strangle her before cutting her throat. She had suffered a single stab wound to the skull, which had penetrated her brain. She was still alive, but died shortly after her admission to the hospital. The door to her property was ajar, and investigators found no sign of forced entry to her home. Several items of jewellery had been stolen. At the time of these 2 murders, Cummings was stationed in Cologne, although when on leave he is known to have frequently visited London, residing at an address in nearby St John's Wood. On Sunday, the 8th of February 1942, Cummings left an RAF establishment in St John's Wood to visit his wife at the flat they rented in Southwark. He borrowed a £1 note from his wife, approximately £40 in 2024, spending that he intended to visit the West End for a night on the town. Cummings left his home shortly after 6:30 p.m. The following morning, the body of 41-year-old pharmacist Evelyn Hamilton was discovered by an electrician named Harold Batchelor in a street-level air raid shelter in Montague Place, Marylebone. Her clothes had been disarranged and a scarf wound around her head. Scuff marks on her shoes and broken sections of mortar scattered near her body indicated Hamilton had fiercely struggled with her attacker, who had raised her skirt above her hips, pulled her underwear below her knee and exposed her right breast. Her handbag, containing approximately £80, had been stolen, although some of the contents were found strewn about the pavement outside the air raid shelter. Her empty handbag was later found by a police officer on nearby Wyndham Street. No fingerprints were recovered from any of her possessions. Her body was identified by her landlady, Catherine Jones, on the 10th of February. The day prior to her murder, she had resigned from her position managing a Hornchurch chemist, which she experienced financial hardships due to the onset of the war, and travelled to London via train. At 6:40 p.m. on the 8th of February, she is known to have informed a Mrs. Maud Yoxall of her plans to leave London and travel to Lincolnshire the following day, as she had been offered a managerial position at a pharmacy in Grimsby. She was last seen alive by a waitress at the Maison Lyons Corner House in Maple Arch shortly before midnight, drinking a glass of wine to celebrate her 41st birthday. The location of her body led investigators to conclude that she'd either been accosted or attacked as she walked back to her boarding house in the early hours of the following morning. Her post-mortem revealed that she had been manually strangled by a left-handed individual. She had not been essayed or mutilated, although numerous small cuts and scratches had been inflicted on her right breast, and a cut measuring 1 inch had been inflicted to her left eyebrow. Shortly after 8:30 a.m. on the 10th of February, 2 meter readers discovered the naked and mutilated body of 34-year-old Evelyn Oatley lying upon a bed in a flat at 153 Wardour Street, Soho. She'd been beaten around the mouth and chest and strangled into unconsciousness before a 6-inch cut had been inflicted to her throat, severing her right carotid artery, leaving her head hung over the edge of the bed. She'd have been extensively sexually mutilated with a safety razor blade and a tin opener post-mortem. She'd also been sexually violated. A pair of blood-smeared curling tongs were also found close to her body, and a blood-stained razor blade lay to the left of her head. In addition, the contents of a leather handbag were strewn across the floor of her bedroom, and 7 unused Gillette safety razor blades were recovered from the small nightstand beside her bed. The door to her apartment had been closed, but not locked. No defensive wounds were found upon her hands, nails, or arms. Detective Chief Superintendent Frederick Cherrill was able to determine that fingerprints recovered from the blood-stained tin opener and upon the corner of a broken section of mirror found within her leather handbag had also been used to mutilate her body, indicated that her murderer was a left-handed individual. No match for this set of fingerprints could be found within the Police Fingerprint Bureau, indicating that the murderer had no police record. She was also a married woman who, at the outbreak of World War II, had turned to prostitution, using the alias Nita Ward to supplement the income she earned as a nightclub hostess. 3 eyewitnesses later informed investigators that she'd been approached by a young, clean-shaven and mustachioed airman with chestnut brown hair, approximately 5'8" in height, outside a restaurant in Shaftesbury Avenue late in the evening prior to a murder. According to these witnesses, when she had asked this individual what his sexual preferences were, he simply replied, "I like blondes." She was then last seen by a fellow tenant of 153 Wardour Street named Ivy Poole, who observed her enter the stairwell to the property in the company of this individual at approximately 11:40 p.m. According to Poole, shortly after midnight, she was awoken by a sudden increase in the volume of Oatley's wireless. She didn't investigate the disturbance. In the early hours of Wednesday, the 11th of February, 43-year-old Margaret Florence Lowe was murdered in a flat at 11 Gosfield Street, Marylebone. She was last seen alive by her neighbour Florence Bartolini at approximately 1:15 a.m. walking along the corridor to a flat in the company of a client. Bartolini had heard the man exit Lowe's flat, walk down the corridor onto Gosfield Street, whistling to himself. Her body remained undiscovered until the afternoon of the 13th of February, when her 15-year-old daughter Barbara visited her mother, only to be told by a neighbour that her mother hadn't been seen for 2 or 3 days, and that a parcel had remained unclaimed outside her door for the same length of time. Lowe was found on her bed beneath the quilts, which were raised just below her chin. She was on her back with her legs apart and her knees bent upwards. She'd been extensively beaten and strangled to death on her divan bed with a silk stocking which was still knotted beneath the right side of her jaw. Froth was visible around her nose and mouth. Upon examining her body, forensic pathologist Sir Bernard Spilsbury remarked that the injuries inflicted by her murderer were quite dreadful, adding that the perpetrator was a savage sexual maniac who indulged in wicked lust to perpetrate the most diabolical injuries on women he killed. The mutilations inflicted on her surpassed the savagery of those her murderer had inflicted upon Oatley, with some mutilations inflicted whilst she had still been alive, although at the point of death. Spilsbury was also able to determine the injuries inflicted on Lowe's body left little doubt that her murderer had also been responsible for the death of Evelyn Oatley. Forensic experts recovered fingerprints from the base of a glass candlestick holder standing upon the bedroom's mantelpiece, plus a glass tumbler and a half-drink bottle of Hamilton's oatmeal stout also found at the crime scene. The fingerprints upon the glass candlestick holder were found to belong to the perpetrator's right hand, indicating the perpetrator was left-handed. Lowe was a widowed mother of one who hailed from Southend-on-Sea. Following the death of her husband in 1932, she had sold the family fancy goods business. She later enrolled her daughter in a boarding school before relocating alone to London, where she obtained employment as a house cleaner in 1934. Shortly thereafter, using the alias Peggy Campbell, she began to engage in prostitution. Although every third weekend, Barbara would travel to London from Southend via train to visit her mother, and Lowe would devote her weekend to social activities such as visiting the cinema and local landmarks with her daughter. On Thursday, the 12th of February, Cummings accosted a 25-year-old prostitute named Catherine Mulcahy in Regent Street. Mulcahy, who sold sex using the alias Kathleen King, agreed to take him to a flat in nearby Southwick Street. The two travelled to a flat via taxi, with Cummings giving her the agreed fee of £2 in advance. Upon entering her flat, Mulcahy lit her gas fire and began removing her clothes, but didn't remove her boots. She later stated a strange smile appeared on Cummings' face as she removed her clothing, laid upon her bed, and beckoned him to join her. He removed his clothes, then approached her, clambered on top of her, slammed his knees into her stomach, and attempted to strangle her as he pinned her body to the bed with his own weight. She fought him, kicking his stomach with her boot and breaking free of his grasp as he fell to the floor beside her bed. She then ran screaming from her flat to the house of a neighbour. Possibly as means of deterring her from reporting the assault to police, he partially dressed himself before approaching the neighbour's flat. He then gave her a further 8 £1 notes, stating, "I'm sorry, I think I had too much to drink this evening," as she repeatedly shrieked her belief that he was a murderer. He then grabbed his coat and fled, unwittingly leaving his RAF webbing belt at her address. Shortly after his assault upon Mulcahy, Cummings encountered 32-year-old Doris Jurnett, also known as Olga. She was last seen alive at approximately 10:20 p.m. on the 12th of February by a friend named Beatrice Lang, with whom she drank a shot of whiskey at a corner house tea room. According to Lang, Jurnett stated she intended to visit a regular client whom she referred to as the Captain. The two then parted company on Oxford Street. Shortly thereafter, Jurnett encountered Cummings, accepted his proposal, and took him to the 2-room ground floor flat at 187 Sussex Gardens, Bayswater, that she shared with her husband. The following evening, her husband Henry returned to the flat he shared with his wife. Noting that the bedroom door was locked, he unsuccessfully attempted to pry the door open before phoning the police, who dispatched a constable named William Payne to the property. Urging Henry to remain in the hallway, Payne pried open the door, turned on the light, discovering Junett's body, naked except for a black open nightgown lying diagonally across the bed with her left hand placed between her legs. A silk stocking was knotted around her neck. Payne then exited the room, stating to Henry, "I must advise you to not go in that room." He then returned to the Paddington police station to request the station officer alert Scotland Yard's Criminal Investigation Department and the divisional surgeon to his discovery. Divisional Detective Leonard Clare arrived at Sussex Gardens shortly after 8 p.m. His examination of the body at the crime scene revealed her jaw had been broken before she had been strangled with a stocking knotted beneath the left side of her chin. The flesh beneath her right breast had been carved away. The knife used to mutilate her had been placed on her thigh. 2 used condoms lay on the floor beside the bed, and a gold watch and approximately £5 had been stolen from the flat. Sir Bernard Spilsbury conducted her autopsy at the Paddington mortuary on the 14th of February. Via examining the spillage of blood from her wounds, Spilsbury was able to determine that the murderer had strangled her to the point of death before her murder and had first mutilated her breast and left thigh before she died. All of the wounds had been inflicted post-mortem. In reference to the nature of the wounds to her body and the locations that they had been inflicted, Spilsbury noted that the murderer had exercised a degree of calculated restraint when disfigurating her above the navel, but that he had worked himself into an evident frenzy. Jurnett was known to only occasionally resort to street-level prostitution. She had married her husband, who had previously been a client of hers, in November 1935, and had remarked to other West End prostitutes that she would only sell sexual favours when she needed a few extra shillings to supplement the money given to her by her elderly husband, who managed a hotel in Sloane Square. She would engage in prostitution when her husband slept overnight at the hotel, as his employment frequently required him to do. Due to wartime restrictions on newsprint, the murders committed by Cummings initially received only limited press coverage, largely because of the ongoing global conflict. Nonetheless, the murders quickly became the prime topic of conversation among West End prostitutes, many of whom became increasingly reluctant to offer their services to individuals they didn't consider regular clients. On the 13th of February, the bodies of Lowe and Jurnett were discovered just hours apart. Both murders were soon linked to the murder of Evelyn Oatley, and the perpetrator was dubbed by the press as the Blackout Killer. The murders became nationwide headlines. On the evening of the 13th of February 1942, Cummings accosted a young married woman named Margaret Hayward in Piccadilly. After sharing a drink and a sandwich at the London Trocadero, they walked in the direction of Haymarket. Hayward later stated that at this point Cummings became unpleasantly forward towards her, pushing her into a doorway near Piccadilly Circus and groping her waist as he attempted to persuade her to accompany him to a nearby air raid shelter. Hayward consented to a single kiss before informing Cummings that she did not know of any nearby air raid shelters, stating, Cummings then began fondling Hayward, who remonstrated against his actions, and she struck at his wrists and pushed his hands away from her body, then attempted to leave. In response, Cummings seized her by the throat and pushed her back into the doorway. Hayward was then strangled into unconsciousness as Cummings repeatedly muttered the words, "You won't." As Cummings rifled through a handbag, he was disturbed by an 18-year-old delivery boy named John Shine, who was carrying bottles of drink into the nearby Captain's Cabin pub, forcing Cummings to flee the scene, leaving his RAF-issued gas mask and haversack in the doorway. Shine immediately ran to Hayward's assistance. Knowing Hayward had regained consciousness, he then offered to accompany her to the hospital. En route, they encountered a policeman named James Skinner, who suggested they accompany him to the West End Central Police Station to provide witness statements detailing Hayward's attack before an officer accompanied her to a nearby hospital. Immediately after his attack on Hayward, Cummings visited a nearby pub where he realised that he'd left his gas mask and haversack at the site of the attempted murder, and that the service number printed inside the haversack would be traced to him. In an effort to concoct an alibi, he stole another airman's gas mask and haversack before returning to base. Detective Sergeant Thomas Shepherd formally questioned Cummings on the morning of the 14th of February. He protested his innocence and claimed that he'd spent the evening drinking whiskey and bitter with a corporal whose name he couldn't recall at the Volunteer Public House in Baker Street before they took a taxi to Shaftesbury Avenue. According to Cummings, he drank several shots of spirits at a bar before engaging in conversation with a woman. He further claimed to only hold hazy recollections of this conversation with this woman due to his intoxication, although he did claim to have a hazy recollection of walking on the street in a company before realising in the early hours he had violated his curfew and immediately returned to his base. He claimed to have no memory of attacking Hayward, but expressed his regrets and offered to pay her compensation. Questioned as to why the knuckles upon his left hand were cut and bruised, Cummings claimed to have received the wounds while performing maintenance upon an aeroplane engine. Immediately after Cummings provided a written statement of his account of the previous evening's events, he was arrested, held on remand upon charge of causing grievous bodily harm. An examination of the entries within a billet passbook on the 15th of February indicated Cummings had reported back to the billet before 10:30 p.m. on the dates of the murders and attempted murders investigators had ascribed to the blackout killer. However, many entries had been written in with lead pencil, meaning entries within the book could easily be manipulated. Furthermore, several of his entries for the past month of February were incomplete, as although he had inevitably signed the passbook when leaving the base, he'd frequently failed to sign in upon his return. Questioning of Cummings' fellow airmen revealed that they had a habit of vouching for each other's return to base, and that Cummings had spent extravagantly in the week prior to his arrest. Detective Chief Inspector Edward Greeno further discovered Cummings and another airman named Felix Sampson had left the billet via a fire escape after midnight on each of the dates in question, and both hadn't returned to the base until the early hours of the morning. A search of Cummings' possessions revealed that he'd taken various items belonging to the four women linked to the blackout killer as keepsakes. One of the items had been a white metal cigarette case engraved with the initials LW, which had belonged to Evelyn Oatley. This cigarette case was discovered hidden inside a kitchenette alongside a photograph of Oatley's mother. Traces of blood were also recovered from a shirt retrieved from his kit bag and the inner surface of his belt. Furthermore, an examination of the trouser turnips of Cummings' military uniform revealed traces of a distinctive brick dust mixture found at the air raid shelter in which Evelyn Hamilton's body was discovered. Chippings of the mortar were also recovered from Cummings' haversack. Detective Chief Superintendent Frederick Cherrill was also able to match the fingerprint of Cummings' left little finger and thumb with prints found upon the tin opener and a broken mirror found near the body of Evelyn Oatley. Cherrill later confirmed the fingerprints recovered from two other crime scenes belonged to Cummings. Two of the 10 £1 banknotes Catherine Mulcahy's attacker had given to her before and after he had assaulted her were brand new. Via tracing the serial numbers of these banknotes, Detective Chief Inspector Edward Greeno was further able to determine that these two notes had been issued to Cummings on the 12th of February. Both Hayward and Mulcahy were later asked to view a police lineup to identify their attacker. Mulcahy was unable to positively identify her attacker, although Hayward unhesitantly identified Cummings as the man who had assaulted her. Cummings continued to possess his evidence, claiming Hayward was mistaken and that another airman must have switched his own gas mask and haversack with his, and may have left the items at the site of the attempted murder in an effort to frame him. On the 16th of February, Edward Greenough drove to HM Prison Brixton to interview Cummings, who recounted his movements between the 9th and 13th of February. He insisted that he had never encountered any of the murder victims and claimed to be unable to recognise their photographs. When presented with the victims' personal belongings recovered among his own possessions, Cummings claimed that the items had been taken from a service respirator case I was carrying when arrested, but which was not mine. He then recounted his claim that he had either picked up the wrong haversack or another airman had switched his own gas mask and haversack with him. Unconvinced of Cummings' claims, Greenough informed him that he was being charged with the murders of Oatley, Lowe and Jurnett the following morning. He was held on remand at HM Prison Brixton to await trial. He was further charged with assaulting Hayward and Mulcahy on the 20th of February. On the 27th of March, he appeared again before a judge at Bow Street Magistrates Court. On this occasion, he was further charged with the murder of Evelyn Hamilton. His trial for the murder of Evelyn Oatley began at the Old Bailey on the 24th of April 1942. He was tried before Mr. Justice Acquith. Cummings entered a plea of not guilty to the charge against him. The clerk then informed the jury the prosecution consisted of Christmas Humphreys KC and G.B. McClure KC, with Dennis Nowell Pritt KC initially appointed to defend Cummings. However, owing to a legal technicality on his first day of the trial, the presentation to the jury of crime scene photographs of Margaret Florence Lowe, the jury was excused from duty. The trial then restarted before a new jury on the 27th of April, the defence now consisting of John Flowers KC and Victor Durand KC. Cummings himself seemed uninterested in the legal proceedings, occasionally chatting in a light-hearted manner with his lawyers or turning from the bar to smile and wave at his wife, who believed in his innocence. In his opening statement on behalf of the prosecution, Humphreys outlined the discovery of Oatley's body, the injuries inflicted to her body, the weapons her murderer had used to perform these mutilations, and the fingerprints recovered at the crime scene. Referring to the prosecution's intention to link Cummings to the murder by the fingerprints investigators had recovered, Humphreys stated, "The first witnesses to testify on behalf of the prosecution was Detective Chief Superintendent Frederick Cherrill, who stated that he was prepared to publicly stake his reputation. The fingerprints found upon the tin opener and broken mirror at the crime scene, which had been used to extensively mutilate Oatley's body, belonged to Cummings." Cherrill repeated his claims during cross-examination from John Flowers, who contended the fingerprint upon the tin opener was too faint to determine a precise identification, stating the quality of the fingerprint was typical for a fingerprint left upon a metal surface, and that any individual who touched the same surface would leave a fingerprint impression of the same quality. In response to further questioning as to discrepancies in the distance between points of identification upon the enlarged photographs of Cummings' fingerprints and those retrieved at the crime scene on display in the courtroom, Cherrill stated the points of discrepancy would appear very great in enlarged photograph, adding that original fingerprints can extend up to 4 mm depending on the degree of pressure to which they are subjected. Sir Bernard Spilsbury followed Cherrill into the witness box to testify as to the autopsy he had conducted upon Oatley's body. Spilsbury testified that the cause of death had been a deep cut to her throat, that Oatley would have bled to death in less than 5 minutes, and that the death occurred at approximately 12:30 a.m. on the morning of the discovery of the body, although the actual time of her death could have been up to 2 hours before or after this time. Felix Sampson then testified that between 10:30 and 11 p.m. on the night of Oatley's disappearance, he and Cummings had accosted 2 prostitutes outside the Monaco restaurant in Piccadilly Circus. The two had agreed to reconvene outside the restaurant after taking care of business. Sampson testified that he had arrived back outside the restaurant at approximately 11:30 p.m. and had waited roughly 25 minutes for Cummings to appear before walking alone to a local pub. He had arrived back at St John's Wood at approximately 6 a.m. only to find Cummings asleep. When he later asked Cummings what time he had arrived back at the billet, Cummings had replied about 3:30 or 4 in the morning, adding, "The woman I went with didn't satisfy me, so I went to find someone else." Cummings chose to testify in his own defence on the 27th of April. He denied any culpability in Oatley's murder, insisting that he'd been in the company of another woman on the 10th of February before returning to his billet. In reference to Sampson's testimony, Cummings admitted to having lied in his statement to Detective Chief Inspector Edward Greenough that he and Sampson had reconvened outside the Monaco restaurant at approximately 10 p.m, adding the primary reason was that he'd been afraid because Greenough had intimidated in his initial questioning on the 16th of February, stating to him, "We have a rope around your neck and we are going to hang you with it." After he had admitted to being in Oatley's company shortly before her murder, he had insisted that she'd been alive and well when he'd last seen her. He also claimed to have been too drunk on the evening of her death to recall the actual timing of his whereabouts or actions, adding, "I had not a watch myself, and, of course in the dark, one cannot see public clocks." Mr. Justice Asquith, presenting his summation of the case to the jury prior to the deliberations on the 28th of April 1942. Both counsels presented their closing arguments to the jury on the 28th of April. Upon completion of both counsels' closing arguments, Mr. Justice Asquith delivered his final instructions to the jury. This address lasted for more than an hour, with the judge outlining key points presented by both prosecution and defence. At 4 p.m, the jury retired to consider their verdict. The jury returned their verdict at 4:35 p.m, having deliberated for just 35 minutes. Each juror avoided making eye contact with Cummings as they fled back into the courtroom. When asked by the court clerk as to their verdict, the foreman replied, "Guilty of murder." Cummings displayed no emotion as the verdict was read out loud, although his wife burst into tears. He was then asked whether he had any legal reason or cause as to why the court should not impose the penalty of death. In response, Cummings replied, "I'm completely innocent, sir." Cummings was then formally sentenced to death by hanging. Upon imposing this sentence, Mr. Justice Asquith stated, "Following his conviction, Cummings was held in a condemned cell at Wandsworth Prison to await execution. He voiced no concern over his predicament, although he did lodge an appeal against his conviction. His appeal was rejected by the Lord Chief Justice in early June 1942. Gordon Cummings was executed by Albert Pierrepoint at Wandsworth Prison on the 25th of June 1942. Contemporary news reports indicate Cummings was given a glass of brandy to calm his nerves. He then walked to the scaffold, flanked by two warders, without offering any resistance. The entire execution process lasted less than 2 minutes. His execution was conducted during a German air raid upon London. He is the only convicted murderer in British criminal history known to have been executed during an air raid. Cummings protested his innocence to the end. His wife and family were unwavering in their belief of his innocence and visited him on a frequent basis until his death. His body was buried within the confines of the prison. Charges relating to the other 3 blackout killer murders remained on the file. Scotland Yard investigators later stated they strongly believed Cummings had murdered all 4 women, in addition to the 2 women murdered in October 1941, whilst he had been stationed in Cologne prior to his November 1941 posting to Cornwall. I hope you enjoyed the video. Let me know what cases you would like to see and what are your thoughts and opinions about this case.